Look at the Ford factory floor in 1946. It is loud, bleeding cash, and dying. Now look at a 2026 Amazon fulfillment center. It is eerily quiet, fiercely profitable, and tracking the precise microseconds of a worker's bathroom break. The distance between these two worlds wasn't built by a machine. It was built by a man who realized that if you can turn a human being into a spreadsheet cell, you can control them forever. You are currently living in a world built by this ghost. A ghost who doesn't care about your name, your exhaustion, or the nuance of your craft. Whether you are staring at a performance review in a glass-walled office or being tracked by an algorithm in a warehouse, you are managed by a philosophy born in the smoke-filled boardrooms of the mid-20th century. You are being optimized. And in 2026, that is just a polite way of saying you have been reduced to a data point on a glowing screen. You feel this pressure in your wallet when prices surge based on predictive modeling. You feel it in your gut when your job security is decided by a line graph. This is the McNamara Fallacy. It is a mental prison suggesting that if you cannot count something, it simply does not exist. It is a reality where the ledger is more real than the bleeding person holding it. Let us open the case file on the man who taught the world how to trade its soul for a spreadsheet. Robert McNamara. The year is 1946. Ford Motor Company is a rotting industrial empire. The legendary Henry Ford, a man who built a definitive American era with his bare hands and an iron-fisted ego, had left the company in a state of chaotic, primitive decay. They were not just losing money, they were hemorrhaging it. By some estimates, Ford was burning $9 million every single month. That is over $140 million a month. In today's currency, they lacked anything resembling a modern accounting department. Legend has it they used to weigh massive piles of paper invoices on a scale, just to estimate how much capital they owed their suppliers. It was a factory running on intuition and grease, and it was flatlining. Enter the Whiz Kids. Led by a brilliant, cold-eyed young man named Robert McNamara, a group of 10 former Army Air Forces officers marched into Dearborn, Michigan. These were not car guys. They had no grease under their fingernails. They held no passion for the sleek curve of a fender. They were the architects of statistical control. During the grim years of the war, they had not flown bombers. They had calculated exactly how many bombers were needed to incinerate a city, using the absolute least amount of fuel. They were the first true professional managers, but McNamara didn't see a car company. He saw a math problem. To the old guard at Ford, a car was a machine of steel and sweat. To McNamara, a car was a strict collection of unit costs and depreciation schedules. He didn't just walk into the room, he brought an entirely new language. A dialect of columns and rows acting as an impenetrable wall between the executive suite and the factory floor. He was not interested in the visceral feel of the drive. He was obsessed with the standardized variants. This was the birth of the corporate technocrat. McNamara's weapon of choice was the IBM 650 magnetic drum data processing machine. It was a beast of a computer. It filled entire rooms, humming with the brutal heat of thousands of vacuum tubes. He used it to turn the messy, human business of making cars into a clinical, bloodless exercise in efficiency. He cut the fat. He ruthlessly streamlined the supply chains. And for a brief moment, the numbers looked miraculous. He was the unquestioned hero of the balance sheet. But a dark shadow was growing behind the success. By prioritizing only what could be measured, speed of production, cost of materials, profit per unit, he began to suffer from a fatal fiduciary myopia. He ignored the variables that do not fit neatly into a cell on a table. He ignored the unquantifiable human variable. He truly believed that if he possessed enough data, he could predict human behavior with the same dead precision he used to calculate the cost of a spark plug. He was about to learn that when you treat the real world like a chalkboard, the world has a way of violently screaming back. The first cracks in the spreadsheet didn't appear in the ledger. They appeared in a car that would become the most expensive punchline in American history. The trap was set with the best of intentions and the worst of tools. A mountain of stale data. To truly understand the McNamara fallacy, you have to look at the Ford Edsel. In the mid-1950s, Ford decided to build a vehicle for a consumer who didn't actually exist, using math that was already dead. They called it the E-Car project. It was the ultimate stress test of McNamara's statistical religion. The mechanism of this failure was elegant in its clinical detachment. The Edsel wasn't just a bad car. It was a masterclass in the sunk cost fallacy. First, McNamara's Whiz Kids authorized a massive R&D burn rate based on a fatally flawed premise. Static data in a dynamic market. They spent $250 million. That is over $2.6 billion in your 2026 money, before a single driver ever touched a steering wheel. Second, they relied on massive consumer surveys conducted by Columbia University's Bureau of Applied Social Research. They interviewed thousands of Americans to find the statistically perfect mid-priced car. And third, they completely ignored the relentless march of time. Here is the forensic reality. The market research used to engineer the Edsel was gathered in 1954 and 1955. But the car didn't hit showrooms until September 1957. In the ruthless world of finance, 3 years is a graveyard. By the time the Edsel debuted, the United States was sliding into the recession of 1958. The quant boys had meticulously modeled the desires of a booming economy, but they were selling to a public suddenly terrified of debt. Consumers didn't want a data-optimized land yacht. They wanted cheap credit and gas. McNamara didn't see a car. He saw a probability distribution. He believed that if you gathered enough data points, the absolute truth would emerge like a ghost from the machine. But the Whiz Kids forgot that data is a rearview mirror, not a windshield. It tells you exactly where you've been. It never tells you where you are going. The Edsel was a Frankenstein of spreadsheets, designed by committee and refined by calculators. It featured the Teletouch transmission with buttons in the center of the steering wheel that were highly prone to total electrical failure. It sported a vertical horse collar grille that critics brutally mocked. It was a mechanical disaster because the men at the top were more worried about the standardized labor hour than whether the door handles actually opened. When Ford finally killed the Edsel in 1960, the company had burned roughly $350 million. That was more than NASA's entire annual budget at the time. Only about 118,000 units sold, against arrogant projections of 200,000 annually. They didn't misread the market. They misread reality. The scheme of statistical control at Ford functioned through three ruthless edicts. First, isolate the variable. Every part of the car was stripped down to its absolute lowest cost per unit. Second, centralize the command. Decisions were not made by engineers on the gritty assembly line. They were dictated from a 12th-story office in Dearborn by men staring at charts, not chassis. Third, ignore the noise. Anything that could not be quantified, like the feel of a brand or the shifting aesthetics of a generation, was dismissed as irrelevant static in the system. McNamara's cold, clinical gaze eventually turned away from the assembly line and toward the ultimate system, the United States government. In 1961, he became the Secretary of Defense. He hauled his IBM machines and his Whiz Kid philosophy straight into the Pentagon. If he could optimize a car company, he reasoned, he could optimize a war. This is where the fallacy turns lethal. In the boardrooms of Ford, the cost was merely dollars. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, the cost was measured in young men. McNamara didn't just count bodies. He installed something called the Planning, Programming, Budgeting System, or PPBS. It was corporate accounting grafted directly onto human warfare. Every bullet, every helicopter, every burning village was reduced to a line item. War became a quarterly earnings report. Victory became a projected return on investment. He introduced the body count as the primary metric of success in the Vietnam War. Goodhart's law was in full effect. When a measure becomes a target, it immediately ceases to be a good measure. Think about the horror of that logic for a moment. He applied linear programming to human life. He believed that if the kill ratio reached a certain mathematical threshold, the enemy would logically surrender. It was a simple, bloodless equation. Resource X plus strategy Y equals outcome Z. But you cannot quantify the will to fight. You cannot punch nationalism or raw desperation into a magnetic drum computer. Just as he ignored the fact that Americans in 1958 didn't want a heavy, overpriced car, he ignored the fact that an insurgency does not care about your statistical variance. The smoking gun of the McNamara Fallacy is the Pentagon Papers. A massive 7,000-page internal autopsy, proving the government knew the war was failing, even as public charts proudly showed progress. The data was being actively manipulated to fit the model.
If the master finds
When the
out,
bleeding reality on the ground didn't match the pristine numbers on the spreadsheet, the managers didn't change the strategy. They changed the numbers. Institutionalized cooking of the books. At Ford, this meant forging consumer preference. In Vietnam, it meant forging the dead. The numbers were staggering. By the end of his tenure, The US had dropped more tons of explosives than were used in all of World War II. The system was working perfectly according to the data. The efficiency was off the charts. Yet, the war was being thoroughly lost. The professional manager had built a machine that could measure everything, except the truth. You see the exact same thing today, in 2026. When your health insurance company denies a claim because an AI model says your treatment is outside the standard deviation, that is the McNamara Fallacy. When a social media platform bans a user based on an engagement risk score no human has ever reviewed, that is the ghost of the Whiz Kids. They have traded the quality of life for the quantity of data. And they are hoping you're too busy staring at your own screen to notice the deficit. Robert McNamara eventually left the Pentagon in 1968, but he didn't retire. He moved to the World Bank, spending 13 years exporting his brand of statistical control to the developing world. He turned global poverty into a math problem. He attempted to solve human hunger with the exact same calculators he used to solve the Edsel. By the time he died in 2009, his spreadsheets had conquered the planet. You don't need a history book to find his ghost today. You just need to look at your phone. The academic theory of how we lose our humanity plays out as a continuous, mounting montage of modern corporate life. The trap closes in 4 silent clicks. First, your company measures what is easy, like your daily keystrokes. Then, they disregard what is hard to quantify, like your quiet mentorship of a junior colleague. Soon, they assume that unmeasured mentorship is completely worthless. Finally, the ultimate delusion sets in. If it is not glowing on the KPI dashboard, it simply does not exist. You aren't a person anymore. You are just a resource variance, waiting to be optimized out of the budget. Look around you in 2026. The trap has snapped shut. Your employer tracks your key performance indicators with the cold precision of a 1950s assembly line. If you are a gig worker, your entire livelihood is determined by an acceptance rate or a star rating. Numbers that pretend to capture the brutal complexity of your labor, but truly only measure your blind compliance with the machine. This is algorithmic Taylorism. It is the digital straitjacket. It is the crushing weight of a system that values the map far more than the actual territory. When a hospital chain prioritizes patient throughput over actual recovery time, or when a school district measures standardized test scores instead of critical thinking, they are executing the McNamara blueprint. They are amputating the parts of the human experience that are too messy, too quiet, or too defiant to fit into a cell on a table. We have built a civilization obsessed with optimization, but we never stop to ask what exactly we are optimizing for. McNamara's great failure wasn't that he was bad at math. He was a genius at math. His fatal flaw was technocratic hubris, the absolute belief that the world is a closed system, a ledger that can be perfectly balanced if you just carry the one. But life is not a ledger. It is a chaotic series of unquantifiable variables. Loyalty spite, creativity, and the sheer, stubborn refusal of a human being to be treated like a unit of production. The debt of the McNamara fallacy is finally coming due. We see it in the burnout epidemic, the quiet quitting of a generation that refuses to be just a data point. We see it in the hollowed-out shells of corporations that have optimized themselves into total irrelevance. They saved 5 cents on the manufacturing screw, but they lost the customer's trust forever. The next financial crisis won't come from old-fashioned greed. It will come from our blind overconfidence in models. It will come from an AI that decides systemic mortgage risk without understanding human panic. It will come from a hedge fund that violently mistakes correlation for causation. From executives who genuinely believe the dashboard is the business. We are one spreadsheet away from another Edsel. The only question is, will it cost billions or will it cost trillions? As you look at your own efficiency metrics tomorrow morning, ask yourself a question that Robert McNamara never could. What part of you is currently being ignored? Because it can't be counted? And more importantly, how long will you let them pretend it doesn't exist? The machines are still humming in the basement of history, still calculating, still counting, still waiting for the next variable to feed the furnace. But remember, a spreadsheet can tell you how many people are in the room, but it can never tell you why they are there. The files are back in the drawer, but the ink is still wet. Is AI just the final, terrifying form of the McNamara fallacy? If you had to choose, would you trust a flawed human manager or a cold AI model to decide your job, your loan, or your medical treatment? Tell me in the comments down below. Let's start counting what actually matters. I am the Shadow Archivist, and this has been Capital Noir. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.